Greetings and welcome to video number 1 looking at liberalism. This is the second video looking at political ideas as a whole, and if you haven't seen the first one yet where I discuss what you will need to know about each political idea, you should definitely watch that first. In this video, I'm going to be discussing what liberalism is, why liberalism happened, and the first key thinker, John Locke. This isn't going to be an exhaustive video. I'm not going to be telling you every fact, every idea, every key word. So think of this as an introduction that you should follow up with your own reading, your own research, especially looking at some of the larger textbooks once you kind of think you've got the idea, the basics. So why did liberalism happen? Well, in the period that we would nowadays would call the Industrial Revolution, or around the Enlightenment, we're talking kind of like between about 1700 and between about 1900, society was changing hugely, especially across Europe. The ways of kings and queens and religious authority was fast fading, and this was one of the key principles behind liberalism. Why should I follow an unelected king? Why should I do what the religious leader tells me to do? Why am I not free to make my own decisions and to live the life I want? And liberalism, the first part of that being liberal, freedom, liberty, is all based around the idea that human beings should have the greatest possible freedoms in deciding their own futures, their own destiny, their own lives, and shouldn't be forced into certain roles in society. Think about the original feudal system back under William the Conqueror, where people were either a king or a baron or a knight or a villain, and people were basically kind of shoved into different roles in society, and you stayed there throughout their lives. Liberalism rejects that and argues that people should be able to find their own place in society through a meritocracy. The bright and the best rise to the top because they have earned it, not because they are born to be that way. Liberalism led directly to constitutions being written across the world. The American Constitution is often is highly based on some of the ideas of the early liberal writers, and to some very violent events such as the French Revolution, where people were forcibly trying to overthrow the old monarchies and to try and instill some sort of kind of people-based democracy or society. However, of course, because it has led to revolution, it did lead in many cases to kind of suffering as well, as some of these countries went through seismic shifts in a very, very short period of time. So what are the core ideas behind liberalism? Well, in short, they are individualism, freedom, rationalism, the state, which is behind me, equality, and democracy. And we're going to look at these in pairs to understand the main ideas behind liberalism. Let's start off with individualism and freedom. You are an individual, says liberalism. That means you are not necessarily, the most important responsibility you have is essentially to yourself. You are not necessarily a part of a social group, either a kind of one based on economic ideas or religious ideas or kind of family ideas. The importance of the individual is more important to you than your membership of a kind of a collective group. You should therefore be able to use your free will to decide what you want to do. And to do that, of course, you need freedom. If you've got a king saying, well, this is your role, this is your job, this is what you've got to do, or a priest or a religious text saying this is the behaviors you must follow, then you are not free. So to enable me to be an individual, therefore, I need freedom. And some of the early thinkers, like John Stuart Mill, argued for something known as negative freedom, which is the idea that you should be free to do absolutely anything you want, unless, of course, you're harming someone else's freedom. So basically, if you think about the ideas like the harm principle, you should be free to do whatever you want as long as you are not causing harm or causing a lack of freedom for anyone else. And in fact, some liberals would go so far as to use a term known as egotistical individualism, which is the idea that people should be free to serve their own self-interests and should be attempting to be self-reliant. Society has no responsibility to you, and you have no responsibilities to society. You are an individual, argue some of the early liberals. Let's look at our next two, rationalism and the state. Now, you might be thinking, quite rightly, that if you're going to completely maximize freedom, then you wouldn't want a state at all, because a state, a government, nearly always puts restrictions upon its citizens. But liberals do argue that there should be a state, and many of them would describe it as a necessary evil, meaning something we don't really want to have, but we, through political reality, we have to have. Because if you are going to be free, then other people have to stop you, must be prevented from harming your freedoms, and therefore the state must be there to ensure that all of its citizens have rights, have freedoms, and are able to pursue their own individual interests. The state is there as a protector, but its role should be as small as possible, argued the early liberals. They argued that citizens should give up some of their rights, but as few as possible in order for the maximum amount of freedoms to be protected. They argue, though, that all human beings are rational. Going to our other word here, they believe in rationalism, which means people shouldn't make decisions based on emotion or instinct or what my Bible or my Quran tells me to do. People should make their decisions based on their own rationality, the ability to kind of sit and to think and to decide what is best for you, what is best for your family, what is best for your kind of local village or your town, whatever it might be, and then to kind of act upon it. And the state should be there to protect your ability to make those decisions and to enable them to happen. So hopefully already you can see that there is a big overlap between these core ideas, because if you are an individual, and therefore you then need freedom to be an individual, and if you are an individual with freedom, you should be able to make your own decisions and decide what is best for you, and then the state, of course, needs to allow you to have those freedoms to enact your rationality and to be that individual. So there's a huge overlap here, but there's also a lot here talking about human nature and talking about society that we want to, that a liberal would ideally want to have. And of course, think about the economy then. What would happen as a result of these kind of core ideas? If you're maximizing individuals, if you're maximizing freedom, then you're looking at an economy where businesses have as much freedom as possible to make money in what you might call a laissez-faire style economic system, with very, very little government intervention taking place. The last two, equality and democracy. Again, extend these ideas. If all human beings are going to be free, if all human beings are going to be able to make their own decisions, then all human beings need to be equal. There's two terms here that you should get your head around, very similar, and one leads on to another. Liberals believe that we have foundational equality. That means all human beings have inalienable rights given at birth, because you are human, but you are an individual, and you should have certain rights. Therefore, this leads unto formal equality, which is the idea that your rights should be enshrined under the law, which is where you might see something like in American history, you see the Bill of Rights as as an amendment to the Constitution. Now in the UK, we have the Human Rights Act. But equality should be formalized, protected by the state to ensure your freedoms and your ability to act as an individual. And lastly, this state, however it protects our freedoms, needs to be one that we have a say in, a liberal democracy, one where we get to choose our government, and we have a government is not forced upon us, it is one that we choose, and one that we choose to obey. Now, let's just be clear here about liberalism. When we talk about equality, we are not talking about socialism. We're not talking about economic equality, where every human being, as far as possible, is kind of given a similar kind of economic outcome. We're talking about formal equality, which is to do with rights, the right to be free, the right not to be slave, the right not to be killed by the state, and things like that. We are not talking about some sort of economic redistribution of wealth. And in fact, quite the opposite, because if you're going to have a laissez-faire style economy, you will have economic inequality. So please don't confuse the two ideas. Let's now look at our first key thinker, John Locke. And I'm looking at him first because he's often seen as one of the kind of the founding fathers of liberalism, and a lot of his ideas did shape what took place in the American Revolution, and a lot of the figures that came after him and wrote about liberalism, in fact, built on his ideas, or maybe in some case disagreed with some of his ideas in their own version of liberalism. John Locke says human beings are rational, so you therefore can use him as a key thinker when you are discussing rationality in one of your essays. He argues that there should be a government, but it should be a government by consent. A famous phrase or idea concept that he used was one known as the social contract, which is that human beings voluntarily give up some of their rights in order to have the protection of and the benefits of a state. But it is a social contract in that it's a two-way thing. A human being gives up some of their rights or some of their freedoms in order to be able to choose the government, and then the government is therefore bound to protect the citizens' rights. It is the state only exists to kind of protect the rights, is the idea that goes out of the social contract. And he argues for a very small government. Here's a quote from him. Government has no other end but the preservation of property. So it should be looking after your stuff, looking after you. It shouldn't be there to intervene in any other areas. It's purely there to protect your property, a very, very small state. He argues that natural rights predate the state. Back to that term again, foundational equality. So he argues that human beings had rights even before governments kind of came around, or monarchies and things like that. So all human beings deserve to have rights. And he argues that where there is no law, there is no freedom. So he's arguing for formal equality. The idea that all human beings should be protected by laws that are statute, enforced maybe by some sort of kind of constitution, and without these rights, then human beings can never truly be free. And he also argues for a limited government, which is something you've probably covered if you've been discussing democracy in school. The idea that you should probably have a constitution, a codified constitution that clearly states what the powers and the limitations to each branch of government are, be it an executive, a legislature, a judiciary. No one of those branches, or one individual especially, is able to become what we might recognize as a dictator or an all-powerful anointed monarch who is unquestionable. And everyone should be under the law, the rule of law, and everyone should have their powers limited and checked and balanced by the other parts of government. And therefore he argues for a clear separation of powers. And that idea of legislature, executive, judiciary is often seen in the ideas of John Locke, and kind of many governments have in fact been modeled under his ideas. The idea that you don't just put all power into one person or one group, you deliberately distribute different powers, different ideas, as far as possible. Think about the American system in particular, where not only do they split between those three branches, but also split between federalism as well. So they really distribute power as far as possible, or separate power amongst lots of different ideas. And the final idea of John Locke to mention is the idea of tolerance. If you are going to allow people to be individual, then you have to accept that people will be different. Now, John Locke didn't write about ideas such as homosexuality and perhaps the rights of different ethnic groups and women and things like that, but he did talk about tolerance. And today, when we talk about tolerance, that is the way we would interpret it. We would talk about minorities, we would talk about rights, we would talk about allowing people to live different lifestyles, perhaps alternative lifestyles, based on their own rational choices. So that is the core ideas of liberalism and your first key thinker, John Locke. When writing an essay in political ideas, you should be using key thinkers as much as possible when explaining the various kind of concepts, because that's what will enable you to stand out from other kind of candidates. And in our next video, we'll be talking about another key thinker, and we will also be looking in more detail at the idea of human nature under liberalism. Thanks for watching. Give the video a like, and let me know if I made any mistakes or any other quotes or things you think might be relevant, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.